Cuban Spanish is the variety of the Spanish language as it is spoken in Cuba. As a Caribbean language variety, Cuban Spanish shares a number of features with nearby varieties, including coda, deletion, seseo, and per second, debuccalization. Phonology. Characteristic of Cuban Spanish is the weak pronunciation of consonants, especially at the end of a syllable. Syllable final per second weakens to or disappears entirely. Word final n becomes syllable final r, may become or even become entirely silent. The fricative variants of d, b, per gram are also significantly weakened when occurring after a vowel, tends to disappear entirely, while n become weak approximants, with no friction at all and often barely audible as consonants. All of these characteristics occur to one degree or another in other Caribbean varieties, as well as in many dialects in Andalusia, the place of historical origin of these characteristics. One of the most prominent features of Cuban Spanish is the debuccalization of per second in syllable coda. This trait is shared with most American varieties of Spanish spoken in coastal and low areas, as well as with Canarian Spanish and the Spanish spoken in the southern half of the Iberian Peninsula. Take for example, the following sentence: Esos peris notin unduenos. Also, because per second may also be deleted in the syllable coda, and because this feature has variable realizations, any or all instances of in the above example may be dropped, potentially rendering. Other examples: disfrutar is pronounced, and fresco becomes. In Havana, Cuba.As is typically pronounced. Another instance of consonant weakening in Cuban Spanish is the deletion of intervocalic d in the participle ending adu, as in cansado, tired. More typical of Cuba and the Caribbean is the dissimilation of final r in some verb infinitives, e.g., para, to stop, can be realized as, the Spanish of the eastern provinces is closer to that of the Dominican Republic than to the Spanish spoken in the western part of the island. Morphology and syntax. Cuban Spanish typically uses the diminutive endings ico and ica with stems that end in t. For example, Plato and gt, platico, and momentico instead of momentito, but cara becomes carita. This form is common to the Venezuelan, Cuban, Costa Rican, and Colombian dialects. The suffix -ero is often used with a place name to refer to a person from that place, thus Habanero, Guantanamera, etc. A person from Santiago de Cuba is Santiaguero, Santiaguino from Santiago de Chile. Questions when the subject is a pronoun are usually not inverted, where speakers of most other varieties of Spanish would ask que acute quies, or que acute quies too. Cuban speakers would more often ask que acute tu quies. Quote, in keeping with the socialist polity of the country, the term compañero, compañera is often used instead of the traditional señor, señora. Similarly, Cuban Spanish uses the familiar second-person pronoun tu in many contexts where other varieties of Spanish would use the formal usted. Voseo is practically non-existent in Cuba. Origins of Cuban Spanish. Of all the regional variations of the Spanish language, traditional Cuban Spanish is most similar to, and originates largely from the Spanish spoken in the Canary Islands of Spain. Cuba owes much of its speech patterns to the heavy Canarian migrations of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Migrations of other Spaniards such as Galicians, Catalans, Basques and Asturians also occurred, though without as great an influence. Much of the typical Cuban replacements for standard Spanish vocabulary stems from Canarian lexicon. For example, gua differs from standard Spanish autobus. The word gua originated in the Canaries and is an onomatopoeia stemming from the sound of a klaxon horn. An example of Canarian usage for a Spanish word is the verb fajarse. In standard Spanish the verb would be pelas, while fajar exists as a non-reflexive verb related to the hemming of a skirt. Much of the vocabulary peculiar to Cuban Spanish comes from the different historic influences on the island. Many words come from the Canary Islands, but some words are of West African, French, or indigenous Taino origin, as well as Peninsular Spanish influence from outside of the Canary Islands, such as Andalusian and Galician. American English has lent several words, including some for clothing, such as pullover and shore. Manners. When speaking to the elderly or to strangers, Cubans sometimes speak more formally as a sign of respect. They shake hands upon both greeting and saying farewell to someone. Men often exchange friendly hugs, and it is also common for both men and women to greet friends and family with a hug and a kiss on the cheek. Cubans tend to speak familiarly. Informality is like addressing a stranger with mi corazón, mi vida, or cariño are common. Mi amor is used, even between strangers, when at least one of them is a woman. Cubans are less likely to use the formal second-person singular pronoun usted when speaking to a stranger, elder or superior. The familiar too is considered acceptable in all but very formal situations. Regular use of the usted form can be seen by some Cubans as an affectation or a mark of coldness. Bibliography. Gittard, George M. Variability, Multilectalism, and the Organization of Phonology in Caribbean Spanish Dialects. In Martinez Gil, Fernando, Morales Front, Alfonso. Issues in the Phonology and Morphology of the Major Iberian Languages. Georgetown University Press, pp. 515–536. Lipsky, John M. Latin American Spanish, Longman, ISBN 978-0-582087613.